Hello, and welcome to the PowerScore LSAT podcast. This is episode 164, and this is Jon Denning from Los Angeles.
And this is Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley.
How you doing up there, bud?
I'm doing fantastic, but I'm more concerned about how you're doing because you had the fires and all that kind of stuff.
You and I have been facing conflicting elements, I think. You've been getting rain and mudslides, and of course everything down here is burning to the ground. Although it does seem to be largely under control at this point, so that's good news.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting because you don't think about it affecting a podcast, but we planned to do this almost a month ago, and we couldn't. That's right. Your power was going in and out, and there was smoke all over the place.
I could say the same for you yesterday. Yes. We're facing similar concerns. I think today we both found ourselves in the eye of whatever horrible cataclysm this is going on for California. Here we are. I'm looking forward to it. This is a fun episode. We do this every year. This has become something like a tradition. I like this one.
Yes, it is. And of course, we may be delayed, but we're not defeated. So this is what we call the State of the LSAT Union, where we're going to recap 2024, talk about some LSAT trends, some admissions trends, and then we'll give a little preview into 2025. And now that we're into February, I guess we're really underway with 2025. So that's the lateness. We apologize for it. Factors beyond our control.
I'm sure a lot of people are losing sleep waiting on this particular discussion. So yeah, apologies are definitely deserved. Before we get into any of that, we are doing this slightly earlier in the day, mostly just to find a window where both of our lights would stay on. What are you drinking?
Nothing exciting. This is the classic. This is my standard go-to early in the day or earlier in the day. That is the Monster Energy Zero Ultra in the white can. Love that.
There you go. Yeah, you've talked about it before. It's amazing we don't have a sponsorship.
Remember that they sent the monster truck out, and I have, I don't know, 100 cans of Monster in my office here.
I do remember.
It was pretty awesome. They sent the monster truck over. The guy was super cool. He talked to me about new flavors that were coming, and then he just offloaded a bunch of cases of it and said, here you go. We appreciate it.
Yeah, for those of you listening, Dave did manage, maybe a year ago, to finagle his way into a Monster Energy drink personal sponsorship, which he's making the most of today.
I wouldn't say it was a sponsorship. Yeah, Monster Energy said, we love you guys, but we are into extreme sports, and that's what we sponsor. But we will give you some cases. And I was like, you know what? That's better than I could have hoped for. So I'm pretty satisfied.
There you go. Did you tell him that I usually wear a helmet anyway? That might have helped.
I didn't, but maybe they'll sponsor you. What are you drinking?
All the help I can get. I've gone a slightly more adult route. I knew we were doing this early, and this week is a conflagration of events. One is that we're recording this right in the thicket of test score release from January. So tens of thousands of people took that test. They're all getting the results back today, this morning, and I'm getting message after message. By the time, Dave, you and I finish this, I'll probably have 50 new Reddit messages from people. And then, of course, we're not off the hook with tests. This Friday kicks off the February exam. So all of that said to justify the fact that I have actually poured a Bloody Mary. Little zing-zang, a lot of Tito's. Cheers.
Zing-zang. Yeah, I'm not a Bloody Mary connoisseur or even a fan, but a lot of people seem to like zing-zang.
It's the best as far as I'm concerned, and trust me, I've been around. But a little Worcestershire, I think I'm saying that right. Where's your sister sauce? And if you hear me crunch a celery stick at some point, you'll know this is authentic.
Better for you than for me.
I'll try to lean back. Say.
Yeah, I don't like tomato juice. I'll eat tomatoes, but not tomato juice. It's just weird consistency.
I eat vodka. So you picked the song for today. We've always kind of gone back to the same formula with this, but I'll let you elaborate.
Yeah, let's not say that I picked the song because I couldn't tell you that I've heard it more than once or twice when we selected it. Every year we do the same thing. We choose what was the best-selling song of the prior year. And sometimes I'm very familiar with that song. Sometimes I'm not so much. It wasn't as much this one. But apparently the song, I had some help with Post Malone and featuring Morgan Wallen, was apparently the top selling song according to Billboard last year, which surprised me.
Me too.
I've heard some Post Malone, but not a whole lot. It's just not really my genre.
I would, even within that genre, which I guess Post Malone's gone country for a minute, like Beyonce, I would have guessed it was probably that Shabuzi song, which I'm not going to attempt to sing the chorus.
No, don't.
But, no, thank you. But that would have been my guess for Song of the Year if it was about popularity.
It was up there.
Yeah.
It was definitely up there. I think sometimes the summer songs just really sell so much, but yeah, anybody who's listened to this podcast for a long time knows that it's not that I dislike country. I've actually been to a number of country concerts because my wife likes them, and I'm happy to go. And people like Keith Urban are insanely great artists.
Yeah.
It's just not my first listen when I'm out there. So
yeah,
there you have it.
I'm with you on that. I've got a lot of family in Nashville, so I'm exposed to this stuff all the time as well. I have no idea what this song even sounds like. I can promise you I've never heard it. But there it is. Top selling song of the year, Oblivious Me.
You and I, the last time we were in Nashville, which was years ago.
Oh God, we went and saw
Muse, with your
right?
sister. Yeah. That we went and saw Muse, and then it turns out that your sister knows. Well, at that time they were called Lady Antebellum.
Yeah,
but she knows the lead singer of What's Now Lady A.
Yeah, Hillary. Hillary.
We met her briefly.
Tried very hard to set me up with her at one point, and that might be one of the worst lunch dates I've ever been on. But that's no fault of hers. I'm sure I'm to blame for that. So it goes.
I'm sure.
Thanks, buddy. All right, let's get into it. Not my love life, the history of the last year and what's happened. And, you know, you've kind of broken this down, I think, fairly well into almost like categorical things. Let's start with just the podcast. How have things gone for this particular endeavor?
You know, I'll kind of look at it from two perspectives. There were a couple episodes that I always, we like to highlight things that we liked the most and that we thought were perhaps the most recent, like 3 or 4 episodes that we'll talk about. And I can tell you that at least 2 of my favorites, John, were, we did one about the new LSAT writing format. Okay, this LSAT argumentative writing. That was episode 149. And we did another one on letters of recommendation. So if you're applying to law schools, what to look for. Those were probably my 2 favorite episodes that we did. Did you have any favorites that were out there?
Well, it's funny. I'm going to mention another 2, so this will pair up nicely. Episode 160, we actually explained how it was, in some detail, how we go about making these crystal ball webinars that we do. I think it was something to the effect of like everything you need to know about predicting LSATs. I think that might be in a subtitle or something. Yeah, that was really cool to talk about because I get asked that question so many times. It's like, how in the world do you guys do this? And why doesn't anyone else? And I think we addressed both of those questions fairly comprehensively in that episode. So I liked that one a lot. And then something that I think you and I probably should get back into a little bit more, twist my arm at least, is conceptual discussions of just strategy, methodology. Episode 162 was about principal questions. And that to me was especially relevant today. In fact, I think a lot of people are probably PTSD over principal questions because of the frequency with which they're now appearing on the test. Particularly, I heard this from a lot of January people where they're like, man, I'm so glad you guys told me to study those in your crystal ball for January because I saw like 8 of them.
Yeah, there's a lot.
Mm-hmm. Again, it depends on what particular content for the test you got. There was no January LSAT. There's like 18 different combinations or something. But principal questions definitely are a heavy feature these days. So the fact that you and I got to break those down in episode 162, I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah, and because they're broader and they're usually, for most people, a little bit more challenging.
Yeah.
I think all 4 of those episodes are great. And you see a lot of different things that we're talking about there, though, from, the idea of admissions to changes on the LSAT writing to even how we predict tests to actual test concepts. I think that's a good mixture there. And, fortunately for us, John, I think at this point, we are happy to say that, we've got a pretty solid listenership. We haven't driven too many people away.
Yeah, I don't know how
with
happy
our
I am about
ridiculousness.
that. Every time someone tells me they've listened to the podcast, and I get this,
I'm like,
I've had this happen to me in multiple Ubers, where somebody's like, "Do I know you?" I'm like, "Uh-oh, are you studying to go to law school?" And they're like, "Yeah." I'm like, "Oh no." This happened when I got picked up from your house a couple of years ago.
I know.
The guy was like, "That was Dave Caloran's house?" I was like, "Oh God." Yeah, forget the address.
No, go away.
Yes, exactly. And now he's gonna move.
Now he's coming for tutoring.
But yeah, it's very gratifying that we have as many people listening as we do. And we actually, with the year's end, have gotten some data on this, which I think is kind of neat.
Yeah, and we love to talk about this because to me, it's endlessly fascinating. I know that when you and I started this, John, I think we would have been happy if someone said, "Oh yeah, you had 10,000 listens in a year," and we had close to 300,000 listens in the past year, just from some of the limited sources. That's not even all of them. We also know that the podcast was streamed in 58 countries.
Yeah,
I don't know if North Korea was one of those, but for some reason, I'm interested to know whether North Koreans might have ever listened to it. Doubtful.
Yeah, any North Koreans hearing this, please weigh in.
South Korea, I know for sure.
I'm screaming.
There were a ton of listeners.
But yeah, you're right. Almost 300,000 different unique listeners over the past year, and that's from places where we actually get the data. Places like our blog, you wouldn't know.
Yeah, we can't really tell. And we're over 1.5 million listens all time. Yeah. So for me, this wildly exceeds any hopes that I had. I honestly was like, I don't know if anyone will listen. And if you had 100 listeners for each episode, I'll be honest, I would have been satisfied with that.
Well, it's fewer apologies.
On your part. I rarely have to make apologies, you making them all the time.
That's typically true. And it's continuing to grow, which is also very gratifying. I know you and I talk a lot about like the crystal ball awareness and the attendees and stuff where, literally tens of thousands of people sign up or register for those things. They don't all attend, thank God. But knowing that we were able to reach this level of audience with this level of precision at the same time is extremely gratifying for me anyway.
Yeah, and if you look at say how Spotify wrapped up the year, once again, the audience that we had increased about 25%, which is pretty cool. The PowerScore podcast was the top podcast for over 1,500 people.
Yeah.
And it was a top 5 podcast for over 5,000 people and a top 10 for over 7,000 people. And to me, that, like I said, I'm always eternally grateful that people will take the time to listen to us. So for all of you out there, thank you.
Yeah. And for any of you 1,500 listeners for which this was the top podcast, if we ever cross paths, please stay away from me. You're making questionable choices.
You can come say hi to me.
Okay, go hug Dave.
I want to know why.
Please keep your distance.
Why are we the top
I do
one?
have questions. So that's a fair point.
It could be worse. There are worse choices out there, so I'll take it.
Let's talk about the year in review.
Let's do that. Let's talk a little bit about the admission cycle. And this will ultimately play, later on we'll talk a little bit about what we see in 2025. But admission cycles are weird because essentially they go the second half of the year and then the first half of the next year. So you get like the second half of 2023 and the first half of 2024. That's one cycle. And then you get a whole new cycle that starts roughly June, July, in 2024 and then goes all the way through the middle of 2025. So it doesn't match up with the calendar year. We're doing this on a calendar year basis. But if we look at that 23 to 24 cycle, that was a super slow cycle. Cycles have been slowing down in terms of admissions decisions, how long it takes to get responses back. I see the direct result in the frustration of people who will message me on, say, X/Twitter or on Reddit. You see this too, where it's just like, why haven't I gotten a response? I think my numbers are good. Other people are getting responses. That is because schools have been dealing with a lot of uncertainty, especially around the LSAT. We had the pandemic numbers that were really juiced up. Yeah. And then we've had the test change coming. And I think schools are, in the face of uncertainty, they slow down. They become more judicious and elongated in their decision-making arc. So if you look at what was happening, the last year, 23-24, it ended up about 5.6% in applicants. LSAT scores were pretty much similar, although the top level scores prior to the LSAT test change were down just a little bit at the high end. Then we hit July 1st, in essentially where LSAT switches over to their new cycle. And when you look at what's happened in 2024, it's been an entirely different story.
Yeah.
Now, probably what happened was a lot of people were able to get into the cycle earlier because they went to take the LSAT earlier. They wanted to take logic games. We're now seeing effects of the loss of logic games. The score distribution to me is strange.
Yeah, me too.
The mid-level scores are all down. So say like 145 to almost to 165, they're all lower than they were previously, whereas 165 to 180 is way up.
Yeah, it's odd, right?
More so than the number of applicants. You know, one of the students I was talking to this morning got a 180. And it's, you know, you look at these things, it always happens, but I saw a lot of high scores this morning. And I've been seeing this, but I talked to one of my colleagues in the industry who I have a really high opinion of, and he was just like, I'm not seeing any scores in the 150s. It's like they disappeared. I'm like, I'm seeing that same exact kind of experience. But so far, there's been a really weird cycle, John, because the numbers are up like 18% at this point in terms of applicants.
Yeah.
So that has really jumped up. And the numbers for 165 to 180 are up even higher.
Mm-hmm.
So when we talk about the rest of this year, and we'll just briefly cover that a little bit later, you're going to see some competitive law school admissions decisions coming up. It's going to be tougher than it was last year, and it's going to be slower even again than it was last year.
Yeah, 2 comments on that. You're right about the numbers in terms of the scores. The bell curve seems to be sort of this like steeply peaked thing that we've all kind of come to expect. It's flattened, and it's pushed people more to both ends. You're seeing lower scores at a higher level too, which I find strange. The second comment is, if you're a school in this scenario and the scoring numbers aren't as predictable or aren't as consistent with past years, which I guess is the same thing, what are you going to do? You know you're going to have enough applicants to pick from, because that's just what happens when you get more people. You're going to wait. You're going to slow play it. And that's precisely what we're seeing schools do. They're taking their time. So if you are an applicant, regardless of where your score is, just be patient. I know that's a tough pill to swallow, but the fact of the matter is schools know that they're going to have enough qualified people to fill their seats, so they're in no hurry. If you've got 6 dates for the prom that are guaranteed, you don't need to ask them until the night before.
Well, I mean, you should give them some time to get a dress and
like 5 of their hopes up.
One would hope that you would be more gallant than that, but
me?
I will say that, you know, one of the offsets here is when you have a plethora of really good candidates, you will see law schools make adjustments to the class size. Now, we went through this years ago, so I don't think it's going to be a massive adjustment. You're not going to see law schools get 40% larger in their classes, but, you know, a 10% increase in class size wouldn't be a huge surprise. They will take more students if they feel that they are qualified to do well in the school. They just have to be really careful, because if they balloon one class way up, they don't have the resources properly balanced. The load balance issue comes in. And so there'll be offsets to this kind of slow cycle with more high scores. And, you know, we're already taking away the conversation about the future. But when I look into 2025, I see medians going up.
Me too.
A lot of the top medians. So unfortunate, but true.
Yeah, I don't think there's a lot of good news in there for anyone listening to this. Except if you can apply soon, you might escape some of the competition to come. Put it that way.
Yeah, we're now hitting the deadlines. They're starting to stack up here, so we'll get a lot more decisions, and that's when we'll start getting into the financial aid conversations, the reconsideration conversations. Which, by the way, I was looking at our notes from last year on this podcast. One of our favorite episodes last year was like 8 rules for scholarship reconsideration.
Yeah, I remember that.
If you're about to get into scholarship reconsideration, that's definitely something to look at. And technically, we'll come back to this point about the cycle at the very end when we kind of talk about 2025, but certainly I don't think anything's going to change in 2025 compared to the last year. It's still going to be slow, it's going to be difficult, and it's going to take time.
There you go. Let's talk about the LSAT over the past year, the past 8 LSATs really. And there's a few things that I think we can point out. The most obvious, I mean, almost inescapably obvious, is that they removed logic games in 2024 after the June test. So the final 4 LSATs of the year, August, September, October, November, did not have logic games. They had 2 scored sections of logical reasoning. If you're listening to this, my presumption is that you knew that already, but this is a recap.
Yeah, and this is the biggest test change in 40 years.
Yeah.
You know, from most people, that that predates when they were born, and so that is a notable kind of change. They introduced logic games in 1982, and I can tell you happily, I wasn't studying the LSAT at that time. I didn't even know what it was. So this is old at this point in terms of what they've done, but that is the biggest test change I've ever seen. And I've seen them do things like, we're adding comparative reading. That was minor compared to this. Another change that they had was the new LSAT argumentative writing. That's a minor change. Removing logic games was a fundamental sea change of the LSAT. Yeah. I have a lot of complaints about it. We've talked about it previously in other episodes as to why they did it, the effects that it had. But this, in my opinion, is what's driving these high scores. And it's also what's driving the increase in low scores.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems to be polarizing more than either one of us would have perhaps expected. I did not see the high score bubble coming. I thought the loss of games was actually going to cripple the high scores more than enable them. But here we are.
I've always been mixed feelings about this, but my theory is that, hey, logic games was a real barrier for so many people.
Is it?
It was also a real help for a number of people, but it was helping fewer people than it was hurting. And those people who were really not great at logic games, they've been freed.
Yeah, that's clearly almost the case.
They've been freed from prison, and now they're fully able to focus their verbal skills and just go out and crush logical reasoning and reading comprehension. And that has created a scenario where you have more high scores. And I think it's directly tied to this at this point. On the flip side, at the lower end, say sub 145, we're seeing a slight increase in scores there as well. And my theory is that if you were down in those areas, in those score bands, logic games, it wasn't that you were scoring great on them. It was that you could go find the easiest game and you knew you were going to get 7 or 8 right. You could go out and you could say, all right, I can at least bank those points. That's gone. And instead, you've got 25 separate logical reasoning questions that you're seeing instead, and that is actually creating a lot more variability, and that's leading to a higher level of low scores.
Yeah. Makes sense when you think about it that way. You're describing basically 2 different groups, cohorts of people. One who could count on a certain number of points from that section that were guaranteed, and another group at the high end who essentially could count on the entire section as free points.
Yeah. I think, LSAC said, when they did all their studies and they did this backward-looking study, which I don't like, they said, the overall scores won't really change. And one of the things that you and I said, maybe we might even whined about it at that particular point, was that doesn't tell us anything about the composition of those scores.
Right.
I've said previously that people who are STEM majors who tended to be really good at logic games, it's a generalization, but bear with me.
Yeah.
That group is being particularly disadvantaged by this. Whereas someone who's, say, an English major, philosophy major types who are more used to verbal argumentation, they're being advantaged. And so it may be that the scores come out roughly the same, although right now it's not looking that way.
No.
But ultimately what we may have is that we have completely different composition of law school classes, because a whole group that used to actually have something that they could rely upon as being good, that's gone.
Yeah.
The breadth of the test has been narrowed, and some people have really been benefited by that, and some people have really been hurt by it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's stratified people in a different way, kind of rearranged them based on skills, which is fascinating to me. I'm sure it's thrilling or disappointing depending on which end of that you're on.
John, it's like a decathlon. And, some people are really good at running, some people are really good at the jumping parts and the various sports that are inside that. And now they've just removed all of the running. And so the people who are really good runners, they're not doing as well in the decathlon. But the other people, say, like the long jumpers and the pole vaulters
really good at
and all that kind
stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, all the different stuff in a decathlon. They're now doing better. And you could say, well, we still gave out 3 awards. There's still a gold, silver, and bronze. I'm like, yeah, but you're giving them to totally different people than would have gotten them before.
Exactly.
That's what's happening
That's
here.
actually a pretty good analogy. I wonder how many of the 10 I could name. I'm not going to test it
let's
here.
not do that.
No, trust me.
Because then after that, I'll ask you about the heptathlon, and that'll just be boring.
Yeah, fair. But that actually is a pretty good analogy. When you change the nature of the sports involved in some sort of outcome, then you get different winners. Mm-hmm. That's what we're seeing.
Absolutely. So if you're out there and you're struggling with the LSAT right now, realize that the game changed. They changed the game, and the pun intended, obviously, logic game. Oh, good. I'm glad you picked up on that.
Okay, Dad.
In any event, it's really not on your shoulders. You can look at it and be like, this is not the same test that it was last year. That's annoying.
Yeah, that's fair. What's less annoying, if you don't mind us doing a quick victory lap here for ourselves, is the crystal ball and how we've been able to do with our predictions and the accuracy of that. We always try to do a fair self-assessment. And I can tell you right now, I'm quite happy that we get to. Because January is the latest test that we've been able to measure ourselves against. That's the 33rd, I believe, of the tests that we've tried to make predictions for. And as I said in the January recap, which might be the last episode of this, who knows? Yeah, is it? Okay. It might be the best prediction that we've ever had in terms of accuracy, in terms of comprehensiveness, in terms of exhaustiveness, frankly, for how much of the test that prediction actually did cover, or the different sections that they worked in. I'll take reading comp as a for example for January, and then I'll expand this. There were 3 scored sections of reading comprehension in January. 1 was brand new. We never make attempts to predict brand new stuff. You can't. It's never been seen. But 2 were reuses. And we didn't just predict the tests that they would come from. We gave people every topic. For 2 of the 3 scored sections of reading comprehension in January, we gave people the topics. That's how good we've been with crystal balls. And that particular one, I think, is somewhere on our Rushmore of success. On the whole, we've gotten 31 of those 33 tests correct. There was one slight blemish in the past year, and it was last February.
Yes, it was.
Yeah. They did some weird stuff last February. We didn't see it coming, but it did inform our February maneuvers for the coming week, which is to say we've backed away from it. February is one of those. Yeah. I mean, you can elaborate too. February was one of those tests that's just notoriously unusual. It's a small group. It's 2 days. LSAT doesn't seem to follow the same sort of patterns of behavior that we've gotten so good at anticipating. So rather than tell people what to expect when we're not sure, we've done the more prudent thing, and I think the more credible thing, which is we've said we're not sure.
And then essentially didn't make predictions.
Yeah.
I mean, if you go back 31 out of 33, the 2 that we missed, both February.
Yeah, 22 and 24. Those are the 2.
Yeah, and at a certain point, you and I started to look at it and say, they're doing things that are different here. This is now its own type of pattern that is unpredictable. And so why try to make a representation of, oh, go spend this time, look at this. When we make predictions, it's because we feel pretty damn confident that what was going to happen is something that we can identify. We didn't feel that same level of confidence. Could some of the stuff we talked about in the Jan-Feb crystal ball show up? Sure. What's remaining, which isn't a whole heck of a lot. It could, but that would almost be more randomized that it showed up. I feel better about tests like April and June that are bigger and have less variability. So we know that February is just that way, but that's the way that it is. We made the call that we think is right. It's been a weird year because back in August, we took the crystal ball and we said, we're not really sure what's going to happen with the new non-logic games test. We were very cautious with it, which I think is why you and I, to some extent, are still mildly surprised we're still doing it. We'll only do it as long as we can get these right. At the moment we don't think we can get them right anymore is the moment these will stop. I think in August, we thought there was a moment where, hey, they may do a left turn here and go in a completely new direction. No more logic games. Maybe they'll do some stuff that'll try to thwart us. We had a lot of hesitation about it. Yeah. We still felt we could likely predict it and that they had to use some of the content we were talking about. And we were really fortunate, but I didn't think that I don't think we'd be here with this level of accuracy. And I don't know whether that'll continue on. I certainly hope so. But it is an interesting thing because this is something that we talk about a lot internally. I have a struggle explaining to any of my friends what it is that we're up to. They're like, what? You can predict standardized tests? I'm like, yes.
Well, that's why I kind of referenced that episode about how the crystal balls even work, because it does give you a little peek behind the curtain. It's funny, Dave, I said to you, I mean, jokingly, obviously, but I said to you, after day one of the January test last month, I said, do you think LSAC is just listening to our crystal balls to figure out what to do? Because was that accurate? It was that spot on. It's like, is this a prediction or advice?
Well, I can tell you in the past, you and I have had debates about whether or not they changed the test they were going to use because of what we predicted.
They've admitted as much. Yeah. We were going to, but we instead, we've timed it well enough, I think, over the past several. And I think they've also gotten indifferent to the fact of like, this isn't a proper cheat code. It just helps. Yeah.
They've always had this feeling about the LSAT that it's so hard, it doesn't matter.
Right.
They've always done that. It's always been that way. It's one of the reasons that they allow guessing to count and there's no penalty for it. Other tests in the past have given you a penalty for guessing. People always ask me, well, why is there no penalty for guessing? Like if you miss a question, you lose a quarter of a point.
These are SAT people.
Which the SAT used to have. And my response was because they think their test is so hard that it doesn't matter. They don't think your guessing is going to appreciably change what happens. Yeah. It's a sign of confidence on their part, maybe even arrogance. And I think they continue to feel that way. They looked at it and they're like, I don't know. And I'm like, well, again, some people get advantage. People who don't listen to it don't get advantage. Anyway, enough about the crystal ball. Sure. There was one other thing that happened in the past year, John, in 2024 that I think is notable. And that was that they took the old prep test system, which had gone from 1 to 94 and stretched all the way back to prep test 1, which is the June 1991 LSAT, and they completely reformulated it. And some people here are aware of the fact that, oh yeah, there used to be like prep test 67 or 88. Right. In another year or two, the students studying for the LSAT won't realize that those existed because they changed the numbering system to go to 101 to 158. So in doing that, they took all those old LSATs, they removed some of them from usage. Yeah. All right, you can no longer use in courses 1 through 18, 21 and 23, the original LSAT, so to speak. And then they just reformulated it all, reshuffled it. So some of the LSATs are whole. Some of them got split up as so-called experimental sections. So if you take one of those new LSATs and it says experimental, that's a previously scored section on the test. But we, those kind of, we talked, I think, about that in, was it episode 148 about the various, the removal of logic games and the new LSAT prep tests and so forth. But this is something that, John, in 5 years, no one will even know that they had these individual prep tests numbered 1 through 94.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Again, for posterity's sake, I don't know that there's much point to explaining this or elaborating on it, so I'm just going to let it go.
Agreed. I think it's notable. It's a milestone. I find it curious because, obviously I'm a student of the LSAT history as well as the future. So for me, I'm like, the old days.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to match them up. I mean, you and I are both like PT 87 or whatever. Like you and I know that test well. We remember the games from it. We remember the logical reasoning questions, the reading topics. They've completely repurposed it into a new number, and perhaps not even with all of its original pieces. It might be intermixed with something else. And so we're having to kind of relearn how these tests are put together.
Yeah.
And I'm still very much in the learning seat when it comes to that.
It just takes time to adjust to the new numbers. Somebody says PT 121, I have to stop and think, which PT is that?
Right.
And I go back and translate. It's like literally learning a new language where you're like, what does that mean in English? You're listening to somebody speaking Italian, whatever the case may be. They did that because since they removed logic games, PTs 1 through 94 all had logic games. Yeah. They didn't want to just come back and be like, this is the new PT, 27 without logic games. So they reshuffled it so they could get 2 LR for every single one, no logic games, and then have an experimental. Super annoying, but that's life.
Yeah, it was the experimental really that required this, because they could have just removed games and been like, here's your 3 scored sections from the original. But to have an experimental, you've got to pick something from a different test that's disclosed, and that's where all the combinatorial aspects of this came into play.
Agreed. Let's move on.
Yeah, I think we should. Let's keep talking category. How about rankings? You want to do that?
I hate rankings. They suck.
I know. I mean, to be fair, I think in episode 151, it's been almost a year, as it turns out, back in April, we kind of lamented that fact, or at least conceded the idea of like, this is pretty stupid. But there were some interesting and notable things that happened with it. Would you agree?
I would.
Okay. You went quiet there for a second. I was like, uh-oh.
No, I was thinking about it. Every single time we have this conversation, we're approaching, like, it's basketball season. Yeah. And NCAA basketball is, I always think about the rankings there. You know, who's number 1, who's number 2. And it's like, yeah, often the schools that are ranked near the top are, you know, prove to be pretty good and get into the tournament and go a little bit deeper. But it doesn't mean the top ranked team is going to win it all.
Yeah.
You just don't know. And I think about this with rankings being kind of questionable, is that it's just a money-making scheme for U.S. News and World Report. They change the criteria a little bit every year. And, you know, this year, for example, they started surveying big law partners and put them in along with the lawyers and judges ratings. So they're like, oh, now we talk to big firms. They're not doing that because they, you know, some big hearts or they're charitable. They really want the widest thing. They need to change it every year. Otherwise, the rankings will largely stay identical. And I'm firmly of the belief, although it is just an opinion and I don't have any factual truth that proves this, that they massage the hell out of these. That the first version comes out, and if they don't like it, they can move it around, because it is, and I emphasize this word, 100% arbitrary.
Yeah.
So it's their choice. Other companies make their own rankings. You can actually play around with kind of like the metrics, and you can see how if you slide one up or down, it completely changes the position of some schools, because schools prioritize different things. But if I'm a law school dean, what I do is I go out there, and if I'm really worried about rankings, which most law school deans are, I look exactly what they're measuring, and then I turn it around and I reverse engineer that and say, how do I get this number up for us? And that's not what I want from my educational institution. What I want from my educational institution is, how do I get the best classes, students, resources, support systems, facilities?
Outcomes, too.
Yeah. U.S. News would say, oh, we survey all of those. I'm like, it used to be that like the number of seats in the library was something that, you know, you measured. Get out of here. It's ridiculous.
Wasn't there even a thing of like library hours, how open the library was? It was something like that.
I've seen, there's just so many, you know, stories from, you know, bygone eras of how this was a black box and so forth. The fact that the T14 has largely stayed the same for decades at this point should tell people something.
It should. That said, there have been a couple of moves within that T14, and certainly within the top 25. Let's talk about a couple of those. Stanford and Yale, for instance, are now tied at 1. I think this is 2 years in a row. That's been the case. Yeah, Yale's been 1 forever, and Stanford's creeped up to compete. Harvard, on the other hand, is slipping. UVA, Duke, Harvard, and I think Penn are all tied, if you count how many there are there, for 4th. And then NYU dropped 2 spots to number 9. They were 7 a year ago. Now they're 9, and that ties them with Northwestern and Michigan, something I'm sure they're thrilled about.
I mean, NYU is a great example. They were perennially top 6.
Okay.
You know, there was the Harvard, Yale, Stanford 3 at the top. Then there was the CCN, Columbia, Chicago, and New York. And now they've slipped down to 9 with Northwestern and Michigan. And, you know, I'm sure they probably historically don't feel like they're tied with those schools, even though I think they're both fantastic.
Yeah, probably not. It's strange for me to think that NYU and Duke are now 5 spots apart, with Duke in the lead. No offense.
Duke should always be in the lead.
Shut up. It didn't occur to me until halfway through that sentence that I had picked your school. But it is interesting that UVA now has eclipsed NYU. That's novel.
And, honestly, UVA is a fantastic school, especially from a state level standpoint. I'm not, from an ACC standpoint, I'm not a big UVA fan just because I'm, got a Duke background, but I respect that school. It's a good one.
Yeah. And Charlottesville's a good time, just personally speaking.
I always enjoyed myself when I was there. I like all these towns, New York's a great town as well. You can't go wrong in New York City.
Yeah,
you can, but you can certainly have a great time there.
God. New York's got a quarter of my innocence. Have you been to Yale?
I have not been to New Haven.
Yeah. So maybe hold off on your good time compliments because yuck.
Well, that's Yale, man. I mean, any college is going to have some fun times, late nights. That's what I'm looking for. You go to New York, there's always something open. You can always get what you need there, whether it's food or a drink or what have you. I appreciate cities like that because remember, I live in a small town where it's like, what's open at 10 o'clock?
That's fair. We didn't see a lot of moves with schools coming in and out of the top 14. There was just some rearrangement of schools within that group. Which is to be expected. But within the top 25, if we expand this a little further, we did see some notable moves. For instance, Notre Dame was up, I think, 7 spots. I think they were 27 2 years ago, and now they're at 20. And we saw some drops. BYU and Florida both dropped to 28, down about 6 spots. So moves are, I think, more extreme as you get into the lower rankings. The biggest top 50 move, I think, was William and Mary, which jumped 9 spots all the way up to number 36. They were 45 before, so kind of on the cusp. And now they're comfortably in. And again, if you want to listen to more of these, the winners and losers discussion that we had was back in episode 151, and we went much deeper into it.
Yeah, that's just a glossy thing, but we still said the same thing, which is that rankings suck and that you should not use a hard ranking system to make decisions. You should go visit these schools.
Yeah.
Because, for some people living in Boston would be fantastic, and for other people it would be terrible. And the same is true for New Haven. Some people would love living there and other people would hate it. So why not go see these schools if you're looking at it? And it doesn't matter whether it's Harvard and Yale that you're comparing or whatever pair of schools that is out there. You got to get a feel for the place to know whether or not you would actually be comfortable there.
Yeah.
And it's funny because I've visited a lot of schools, but
say, me too.
Connecticut, I have not spent much time in.
I think that's the right choice.
You just offended all the Connecticans.
Oh, yeah. All 8.
Is that what they call themselves?
Come at me. I don't know what they call themselves. Sad is what they call themselves.
Nah, don't say that.
Oh, sorry. Too much.
They're usually pretty happy with their UConn basketball team up there.
That's true. Yeah, no, it's Utah that I was thinking of. Sorry.
I like Utah. What's wrong with Utah?
The skiing.
Don't say it.
Okay. How much time have you got?
Dude, Zion, man. It's fantastic. The skiing up there is great. Get out of here.
You just said your small town closes at 10. Go to Utah.
I know.
10 feels like
the culture there is different. I respect their choices, though.
Oh, well, at least there's one of us. Since we've kind of talked about a lot of what's happened, one of my favorite things when we do these is we always get the chance to not just recap and reflect. This is mostly in our rear view, but it does give us some sort of forward-looking opportunities as well. So let's talk a little bit about the year to come, if you're game for it.
Yeah, I'm game for it.
All right. I mean, I kind of did hold you hostage.
You knew I'd say yes.
I didn't think you had much of a choice, and clearly you didn't. Let's talk about the LSATs and what do we think is going to happen over the next several months for the rest of this year. Obviously, it's early-ish February. One interesting thing is they haven't put, as far as I've seen, dates up for tests past June of this year, at least at this point. You can register for June, but if you're thinking of taking a test late summer or fall or winter of this year, you don't even know what dates they're going to offer. We could make some educated guesses, and I bet we'd be right.
Yeah,
but so far they haven't announced.
We know there's going to be, in all likelihood, August, September, October, and November as the 4 fall dates.
Yeah.
They just haven't said what dates they are, how many days.
When do you think that information is coming?
Probably this month. I mean, if you look at it historically, 2 years ago, they gave us that information on January 20th. The year after that, maybe it was 3 years ago. 2 years ago, it was January 13th. So, mid-January. But last year it was March 8th.
Yeah.
I think they had some scheduling difficulties. And, when you start switching, like, you have different proctoring facilities, they have to really be careful about what's available and what's not. So I would think that anytime in the next 5 weeks is fair game.
Yeah.
Like if they announced it tomorrow, I'd be like, okay. But I would think the higher chances towards, the third week and fourth weeks of February, most likely.
Yeah, I think we're still a few weeks out. And registration, ditto. That tends to take even longer.
Well, it's always in May. They'll open up. So when you want to start and actually register for August and say, all right, I'm going to do it, or September, or any of those tests, they open the registration for the entire year in mid-May. Previously, 3 years ago, it was the 12th, then it was the 17th. Last year, it was the 20th. Notice a little pattern. Things keep creeping later and later. So
Jinx.
I would think by May 20th, sometime before Memorial Day in the U.S., we'll actually get the capacity to sign up. But you'll know at least 2 months in advance what those dates actually are, so you can start planning your calendar. And I think the test calendar is most likely going to be, by month at least, similar to what we just saw.
Yeah,
so August, September, October, and November. Then they skip December. Then you have a January and February LSAT. They skip March, and then you have an April LSAT, skip May, and then finally a June LSAT. I think they're satisfied with what they're seeing. Maybe I'm wrong, because I know there's been some questions about, do we need February when it's this small? But I think they'll stick with it. At least I've had no indication that they're like going to drop it and do one less LSAT, although that would be easier for them.
I was about to say, if they're listening, please drop at least one. Because, good God. I mean, it really is. I feel, I'm still in some sort of January haze, and we're 2 days away from February testing. So, I'm just trying to keep my head above water here. Debatable success. How about this admission cycle? Because I know this is the question I'm getting more than anything else from people lately, is when am I going to hear back from schools? I applied 4 months ago. I haven't heard a thing. I got a text from an old student of mine a couple days ago. She just got waitlisted at Chicago. And she's like, tell me what to make of this. It's like, well,
it's a mixed bag.
Pretty self-evident.
I mean, what's most frustrating for someone who's waiting is to hear that other people have received a response from the same school. And if you've been using like LSD, for example, not LSD.data or whatever that site is.
All right.
I should clarify. Not that other kind.
I got to make the Molly joke in the last episode, so well done, buddy. Well done.
Wasn't going that direction, but somehow ended up there. Yeah. If you're using like data aggregator sites, how about I say that?
Sure.
You see someone who has similar numbers and they've already heard back from the school that is really your top choice. It's maddening. And sometimes that's just the way that it works. There's something in their application that really stood out, what have you. As I said before, I think this cycle will continue to be slow. The fact that you applied 4 months ago doesn't matter to the schools. Yeah. They are going to make the decision, really judiciously, because several years back when we had the score bubble, some schools made mistakes. They admitted people who had seemingly high scores very early because they're like, oh, this person fits our profile, without realizing that the entire pool was changing and that those people were actually going to be lower than what they wanted later on. And so they had to really scramble at the end to fix that. They do not want to go through that. And I've talked to several deans who were like, LSAC kept telling us that things would revert to normal, and they didn't. So now we're wary.
Yeah.
So when we see test changes and uncertainty, and here we're up about 18% in the cycle so far this year, and it was trending higher than that. It was up like 25, 26%, last month and the month before. That gives them pause, especially when you get more high LSATs, because if a school's sitting there and let's say they have a 170 median, well, if everyone else around them moves their medians up and they don't, guess what happens in their rankings? They fall. So they start thinking to themselves, well, maybe we should think about 171 or 172. And they have to wait and see. They have to look at yields. It takes time. So you may have applied several months ago. You may not have an answer yet, and you may still have to wait another month or two.
Yeah.
The idea of an early kind of like indication based upon when you applied, it doesn't hold. It's about the quality of your application. And this is why I always tell people, I'd rather you wait a month and perfect your application than apply early with a subpar app, because later on the subpar app will hurt you far more than the extra month.
Yeah, this reduced sense of urgency is somewhat new, but it's certainly the case these days. And this is what happens. Look, when you get pick of the litter, you know you're going to have more than enough qualifying options to fill your seats. Then why rush it? Take your time. That's what schools are doing.
No, and that's exactly right. And, several years ago, Notre Dame got themselves in a situation where they way over admitted.
Yeah.
And they, said, hey, here's the deadline for deposits. And then they closed it early.
Okay.
And a bunch of people who had actually been admitted basically got put on hold.
Yeah.
And so their law schools are trying to avoid, back end problems like that. I think we will probably see some further median changes, especially at the top with schools that have a 165 or higher median. There are more applicants out there. They're going to try to jump their medians up. They will also try when they can to increase class size, and that's an economic decision that they make.
It's a resource issue, yeah.
Yeah, but as I said before, they're not going to just go crazy, because when they did that before, the backlash was huge. They ran into some schools weren't sure what to do, whether they should admit a lot more people or whether they should hold their medians. This is an issue from the past, but it informs our view of what's happening right now. I think we'll see slightly larger classes. I think we'll see some higher medians, and there'll be schools that are sitting there thinking, do we admit an extra 15 or 20 students, or do we increase our median by 2 points? And that's the kind of debate that they'll have to go through. And they'll have to think, what are our colleagues doing at similar schools? If you're NYU, you might think to yourself, well, if they're going to rank us ninth, let's juice our median back up.
Yeah, let's at least make some money.
Get it a little higher and not take as many students.
Not take as many students. Yeah, if you're not as worried about the median, then certainly you can just let everybody in, open the gates.
And years ago, some schools did that, and they saw precipitous rankings falls.
Mm-hmm.
I think at one point I'd done a comparison. I'm not sure if it was between UVA and Washington Lee, or if maybe it was William and Mary. It was another Virginia school, and Virginia had held really tight to their class size, and they'd kept their medians where they needed to be, and they didn't change at all in their ranking. And one of the schools, whichever other school it was, had increased their class size, and their medians had dropped a little bit, because this was during a dearth of applicants.
Yeah.
And their rankings tumbled in the ensuing years.
Yeah.
And so you learn these lessons, and they have long memory. So I think that it's going to continue to be a slow process. Medians will rise slightly at various levels at various schools, and we'll see what actually happens. But we'll get a little bit larger classes out there as well, which will be a slight offset.
Yeah, I think you're right. And we'll know more about those rankings. And when do they typically come out? Early April?
Yeah, late March, early April. It's recently when they release rankings, they've had mistakes in them, so they have to recall them immediately.
They had to redo them. That was last year.
Without getting personal about it, that's like amateur hour to me. You're supposed to be this esteemed statistical data organization, and you have on multiple occasions released rankings that have mistakes in them.
Yeah, you published it. What are you doing, guys?
Preliminary problems.
One job.
In one case, it caused like over a month delay. I'm like, oh, seriously, people can't do their jobs. Anyway, enough about that.
Sure.
The other thing that people have asked us about, John, is the argumentative writing.
Which we just had a conversation with LSAC, LSAC about this, 2 weeks ago maybe? We were talking to them about just kind of the coming year. Having a conversation a lot like this, except they did more talking.
Yeah.
We asked them this point blank.
We did ask them this, and right now, I don't think that's going to happen this year.
The question, by the way, I don't know if I might have cut you off mid question there. Sorry. The question that we've been asking and been asked and asked them was, will the argumentative writing, the essay that you have to do separate from the test itself, is that going to be at some point scored? Are they going to put some sort of qualifying number to it, or is it going to stay unscored as it has always been?
Yeah, and let me at least answer that question in broad. eventually it will be scored.
Yeah, it's coming.
All right. We've talked about this. LSAC has indicated they are exploring a scored argumentative writing. And I think there's a number of reasons for them to do this. And it's gotten a lot easier with AI. So they can do it almost instantaneously in the future. So it's coming.
Yep.
The question for me has always been, when is it coming? Usually if it was going to be coming this fall, literally August starting, we'd hear in January or February. So if we don't hear some kind of change in the next month or so, I don't think it will be scored this year. They're probably then, I would say it's almost, I'm not going to say near certain, but I'd say there's a very high percent chance that it'll start being scored in 2026 in the middle. When they make this change, it'll be after the June LSAT of any year, because that's when the cycle ends. July starts a new cycle. So they'll begin it with the August LSAT, probably 2026 would be my guess.
I'm not going to dispute you on that. Except for this, I have seen them introduce changes on the June test. That's when they introduced comparative reading, for instance. Granted, that was 17, 18 years ago.
Yes, and at that point in time, just for a little bit of a historical footnote, the June test was considered... Yeah, let me make you look young.
Young, thank you.
At that point in time, June was part of the new cycle. So that was actually the start of the new testing cycle.
I see.
Later, they switched it, so July is now start of the new cycle.
Look at you.
Yeah.
Sharp as a tack.
So I get your point.
Yeah.
But
so if that's the case, and again, you saw with games going away after June, I think you're probably right. I would say by August of next year, I think they will score the essay.
Me too. I think chances now, if you asked me this question in November and December, I would have said, yeah, I think there's a chance that they will do it here. I think they're probably just working the AI out properly, testing it. No reason to rush it, but there's a number of reasons for them to want to do this. They're going to do it at some point, almost assuredly. Maybe it's getting a little late for them to do it in August of this year, but August next year, I could see it for sure.
There you go. Well, the last thing I wanted to talk about, you may have more, but we had some interesting updates from a company standpoint, internally, updates and even plans for the coming year. Let's go through, and we'll keep this brief, I think, because we're creeping up on about an hour already. But let's talk a little bit about what we did over the last year. We talked about the crystal balls and how that worked, but that's a small portion of what we've actually been up to. Let's talk about the books, because I know we're just finalizing a print run on updates for the 2025-2026 Bibles.
We're working on them right now. We're actually proofing them.
Yeah, I got 7 emails I've got to read about this exact thing. That said, because the test hopefully stays somewhat stable for the next 12 months or so, I don't think we've made a tremendous number of changes that would be considered sort of mandatory upgrades. Would you agree? Should I not say that out loud?
No. I think that's actually the case. We've had to make adjustments. LSAC's policy on question usage has changed a little bit, so we've had to make adjustments there. I've had to remove some questions and change questions out. So that's actually what largely we've been working on. But those 25-26 Bibles will probably come out, I would think, mid-May, early May, somewhere in there. Right now, that's what the timeline is. That's the expectation. But sometimes things change with printing horizons and availability. But we're actually proofing them right now. They'll go off in the next 7 days and be finalized. So, but they will be a little bit different than the prior ones. But certainly, if you're using the 24-25 LSAT Bibles right now, those are 100% applicable. Yeah. There's nothing wrong in any prior Bible. So you'll be in good shape with that overall.
And if you go back far enough, obviously you can find certain references that no longer hold. To Logic Games as a section, for instance. But if you have anything in the last year or the coming year, you're going to be in good shape. The other thing that we were able to launch, which to me is much more exciting than books, we have a whole suite of new LSAT courses that you and I are largely the contributors towards. We did most of the videos, most of the explanations. In fact, for some of these, I think we did all of it. So there's some cool stuff there. 4 tiers or levels, basically, to these courses. We have something called the Starter Access course, which pretty neat, in part because it's free. You can just sort of sign up for it and get not only a taste of what some of the courses contain, but you get some study plans. You get a number of different things that come with starter access, including some access to free LSAT, real LSAT content as well. So that's fun. If you upgrade a little bit beyond that, then you get into a subscription model. And we have 3 tiers of that. There's the LSAT Essentials course, which is basically just you, Dave, and me teaching a full on-demand curriculum of short-ish, you and I never pull too many punches when it comes to missing words, but short-ish videos that essentially cover everything that you could want to know about this course for logical reasoning and reading comprehension. And things like test mentality, which I think often gets overlooked. The higher tier from that adds live daily sessions with some of our top instructors. So every day there's 2 or 3, sometimes 4 different live sessions that you can go to. Some of these are conceptual, some of them are test reviews, some of them deal specifically with content, like a reading comp passage of the day or 5 logical reasoning questions or something. And then the tier above that is called the Elite course. This is the highest level, which gives you everything I've just described. Me and Dave teaching lessons on pre-recorded videos that you can move through at your own pace on demand, live sessions daily with a host of different instructors. And this also comes at the Elite level with private tutoring. I believe it's 2 additional hours a month of private tutoring where you can go, again, every 30 days or so, and you can get together with people for a few hours and get any questions that you want addressed one-on-one, which is very cool.
Yeah, 4 tiers, which I find, it's a pyramid. Yeah. The one thing I will say is this, it's really interesting, John, and maybe at some point we do a whole episode on LSAT licensing, because I think it's fascinating and not many people understand this.
Yeah.
But that starter access course, we're able to give you some questions because you're allowed to do that according to certain parts of the license if you pay for it. But it's limited. We can't show you all the content. So sometimes people have asked us, they can get in there and they can see, well, I get these videos, but there's a bunch of locked content they can't get to. The locked content is actually in the Essentials and the Premium and the Elite courses. LSAC does not allow us to show that to you because you have to have a Law Hub Advantage subscription. And to get starter access, it's not required. So anyone can just wander into the starter access, sign up for it, and at least get a sample of the LSAT, take a look at the way our analytics program works, get a few lesson videos. But I always think of it as a free preview.
Yeah.
No, it's not really a course. It's more a lens into, hey, how does this work? How do they do it over there? What are the videos like? What is taking a test like in their interface? Is it similar to the actual LSAT? Spoiler alert, yes, it is. and it gives you that opportunity. But due to the way the LSAC arrangement works and the licensing works, we can't show you all the locked content. So I know sometimes you're like, can I just see that one video? I'm like, I can't, because that would break our license with LSAC, and we will not do that.
Yeah, that would be a disaster. But it is an interesting taste of what you would get with an upgrade. And I think that's useful for people. Frankly, I'm wary of any company that doesn't let you at least preview some of what they do, because otherwise you're just having to take it on faith. And faith has always bugged me.
I wish that course was called Taste of the LSAT. That would be hilarious.
Well, you know who to call.
Have you had a taste of the LSAT yet?
Yes. It's very bitter.
Ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's very bitter.
I've tasted it. I really eat a raw lime. The other thing that we were able to update, 2 things really, is we updated our website, which has allowed us to integrate even further with our partner company, which is Barbary, that does bar prep, something that anyone listening to this is likely to encounter in the next 3 or 4 years or so, I would imagine, which is pretty neat. So we can really kind of get you started on this full continuum, this full spectrum of a journey. It's not just test prep, it's not just the LSAT, it goes all the way into law school and, frankly, bar passage, which is what you kind of have to do if you want to make a living out of this. And we've updated our analytics and testing platform. I think it aligns a little more closely with what Law Hub does now. And the feedback that you get with our analytics is unrivaled. It's incredible how much data you can see, and what instructors, especially if you're working with one-on-one people, what instructors are able to glean about you from this and the way that they're able to help in response. It's really cool. Anytime I tutor students, I mean, this is my go-to, and this is where I get all of the data as to what to do and what to tell them.
Yeah, I can look at their performance and see that, hey, they're missing all these question types, and that's causing them to miss all these other question types. For example, you miss a bunch of must be true questions. Guess what? It's going to cause problems with strengthen and weaken, and so on. And it allows us to kind of see what your understanding is through that. But it's interesting that you mentioned like what we do with our website and so forth. Yeah, honestly, for those of you who are kind of embarking upon this path, LSAT prep is really just the tip of the spear.
Yeah.
So you'll end up in a long pathway, and certainly many of the Barbary companies, such as the Bar Prep or West Academic with books, and Quimby with study aids and so forth, you'll encounter all those. There's many different Barbary companies that deal with the legal spectrum. I don't think anybody has as many products of as high quality as Barbary does.
Yeah, that's true. In this case, the rest of the spear is not a shaft. It's actually, the whole thing's kind of a weapon to help you. I know a lot of people look at the bar and they're like, man, that's a whole nother mountain to climb. But this journey, I think, helps keep it very linear. This partnership keeps it very linear. And kind of there's this gradient where you turn around and you're like, I've already climbed it, because you're just doing the necessary steps along the way.
It's funny to me. I just think about it's all tests.
Yeah.
You think about it and it's like, all right, the LSAT's one test. Well, you get into law school, you're going to have final exams, which are hugely important. So you got to do all the studying for that. That's really what almost in many law school classes, that's your grade, is how you do on the final. The bar itself is a bigger version test. Now you're being examined on what you just learned over the prior 3 years in law school and stuff that you didn't learn in law school that you're forced to learn.
Yeah. Which is where, again, this sort of preparation kind of comes to fill the gaps, is because you will learn things by taking courses like that for the bar that they test on the bar, but that law school may not have revealed to you, or it might be 3 years old and you just forgot it.
Yeah, you might have forgotten it, or maybe you didn't take that class. You chose a different elective, when you were a 3L, and now it's like, well, you really do need to know this. Or, as you said, maybe you forgot about the rule of perpetuities, or the nuances of it have escaped you, and now you need to make sure you know that. So
who could forget that?
A lot of suite of options in terms of what we do and who we're linked up with.
Yeah, it's very cool. This has been a very gratifying partnership, I think, for both of us. I know for them. Who doesn't love us? So
plenty of people, let me say that. Jon, any final thoughts aside from that, or are you good?
It was a good year, man. We did it. Any year I survive is a good year. As my mom tells me every birthday when she calls, a lot of people lost some bets.
We didn't think we'd see you again this year, Jon.
I remember when I turned 30, she called and that was the first words out of her mouth. Do you know how many people lost bets? I was like, damn. Damn, Debbie.
Funny.
Yeah, she's true.
Debbie doesn't know.
But no, I have no other comments than that. Aside from, I'm excited for the year to come as well. We have a lot of updates and interesting things kind of in the pipeline, and we will certainly keep people informed of those as they get a little nearer to hand.
Well, for my part, I will say that 2024 was one of the most tumultuous years that I recall having to deal with. Obviously, a lot of that was around logic games, but all the systems, all the new courses that we put in place for the loss of logic games, we made a huge change in terms of how we present courses. And just all the material work that was required to remove logic games references, it was just a lot going on. So I have to say that for my part, I'm very happy that 2024 is over and that we've kind of escaped that. It was really a black hole, a vortex of sort that was just kind of always sucking and pulling us back, because it's like, hey, well, now you got to make this change, and now you got to remove this thing about logic games, and there's this, kind of deadline. I felt like it was just a lot of pressurized work.
That's fair.
That said, I think 2025 is going to be probably, for me, one of the most interesting years in terms of doing this, because I know there are a lot of big changes coming, and we will talk about those in the future, Jon.
Yes, we will. I'm looking forward to it.
On that note, if you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else that you may find it. And if you enjoy the podcast, please leave a comment or rating as well. And if you have any questions about anything we've talked about here or that's just on your mind, please send those questions to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. On behalf of John and myself, we hope you had an awesome 2024, and we hope that 2025 is even better. Stay safe out there, and we'll talk to you very soon with the February LSAT recap.